So welcome back to our base camp here. This is a hard session now to follow what has happened before. I reminded us, John Elkington saying sometimes these things are like LSD trips. I think we just had one, a major shot. We're now going back into the deep hard work of implementing thrivable transformation. And this is under the headline of what we call our Sherpa tracks, or our Sherpa track with various sessions around that. And we will welcome one of our advocation partners, Impact Institute. Adrian Ruiz, the CEO of the Impact Institute, will speak to us. And he brings one of the sponsors of this conference as well, AMRO. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, AMRO is a fan of these conferences and supporting us for a couple of years, which we are very grateful for. And it's the mix of inspiration on the one side and the brilliance that we got from Kate and Joe, and then mixing it with practical implementation of our thinking. And this is a perfect example of that. So we'll have 45 minutes for that session, so we will stay in the timeline. And this session will be very much about impact and how to come to impact, how to come to a feasible understanding of impact, how that is also methodologically supported. So this is a co-working space now for the next 45 minutes between Adrian and Tjeerd. And I welcome you both on stage. And Adrian, you're going to start. So here's your clicker. Enjoy.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Not yet. Not yet. Can you hear me now?
Not yet?
No.
Let's see.
Microphone not working.
Now?
Test.
Maybe the microphone is not on? Could that be?
Hello.
Let me just check if the microphone is on. It is on. Yeah. Well, he should have a normal mic. Well, it should.
Work? No.
Just asking the technology. Otherwise, we'll use a hand mic. Well, this one definitely works.
Okay, let's try it again. Can you hear me now? No.
Let's see.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So now you can hear me. Very good. So,
can we please go to presentation mode?
as I said, it's a great pleasure that I'm here and that you can hear me. That's even nicer. As I said, I'm the Executive Director of the Impact Institute. So our starting point, and I think it very much aligns with what we heard before, is the impact economy. We see that the greatest opportunity for this century, or one of the greatest, is the realization of an impact economy. And that is an economy that doesn't revolve around creating more money. Yeah, that's the current financial economy. But an economy where entrepreneurship, technology, innovation, our everyday work works towards creating a better world. We think that is one of the greatest opportunities we have. And the interesting part is that if you look at the past years, markets have brought us a lot. Between 1990 and 2015, more than 1 billion people have been lifted outside of extreme poverty. And that's an amazing feat. That has to do something with, for example, the United Nations Development Goals, but for a large degree it was because markets started working better in more parts of the world. At the same time, of course, there are quite some challenges. There's still around 1 billion people in extreme poverty left that we have to lift out of them. As you know, we have a climate change problem, and in the coming 10 years, around 1 billion species are in threat of extinction. So markets also have side effects that are quite destructive and that we have to mitigate. And so the question, how can we do that? And then you have quite a lot of concepts that are similarly in the similar vein, but the important question is, how can you make this actionable? And so how can you actually make this actionable? And we think one of the powerful parts of the financial system is that they're very well able to measure profit. So that enables a whole system of coordination around that. So if we want to realize an impact economy, you need impact information that is as pervasive and as standardized as financial information. Because if we don't have that, it will be like having your arrow and your bow fighting against a whole battalion of tanks. Yeah, then we will be talking here for the coming 10 years, but not that much will happen. So we really think that that information is key. Yeah? So that is also the goal of our organization, the Impact Institute, is to enable each organization, if you're an investor, if you're a company, if you're an NGO, if you're a government, to, in addition to your financial statements, also have impact statements that show what is the positive and negative impact you have on the world, and as standardized and pervasive as your financial information. So we see that this also fits a global trend. And that's a trend in which you see that an increasing number of companies are measuring and valuing their impact on society. And I will say a bit more about the valuing later. If you would look in 2010, there were just 2 companies who were doing this, at least in public. And if you would look last year, so not this year, but last year, you see that there are many, many more. Mostly on natural capital, but increasingly also companies are reporting on their impact on social and human capital. So this has to do with shifting expectations about what it means to be a successful company. It used to be that you're successful if you create short-term profit. And so if each quarter you show good quarterly profits, then you're a successful company. And increasingly, that expectation is changing. In addition, companies are expected to create value to society, whatever that may be. And that's quite logical. As society, we're getting smarter. That means that the costs of information are lower, so we can better see what an actual contribution of businesses to society are. So that if, as a business, you're destroying value to society, if we're becoming smarter, that will get a price. For example, carbon, that used to be completely free. Then a couple of years ago was around €5 in Europe. In many other places, it's still free. Now, what's the current carbon price on the ETS? About 23 euros. So that's a large increase. And Standard & Poor project that in the coming years, it will go towards $40 per ton. And then it becomes a profit drive, or profit and cost driver. Yeah? On the other side, if you look at health, positive impact, if you contribute, for example, with your food to a healthier life, there's also a positive premium by consumers now that wasn't there in the past. Yeah? So you see that also the value created to society as a company is increasingly driving your shareholder value. And that's obviously a good thing. Now there is one important challenge, because if you think what is the purpose of a business, and we heard that before, a dominant stream was that the social responsibility of a firm is to increase its profits. And that has been a very dominant frame. Now, you see quite few companies saying that explicitly at the time, so more are going towards something like long-term value creation, and then most companies are somewhere in between. But the problem is that we don't have the information to do the long-term value creation. And so if you want to do that as a company, you don't have that information. It's as if you're in a room without light, and you now say, I want to find the exit, but you can't see it. If you don't have this information, you can't do it. So what is a way to solve that? And that is to measure it. So if you want to manage your impact, we believe you have to measure it. And it's quite logical. Suppose you have a company that comes to you and you want to invest in that potentially. And that company says, we have a great product, but we don't have financials. Yeah, you should just believe us. Great story, but no financial numbers. You wouldn't take that company very seriously, right? But currently, that is exactly what's happening with impact. Companies and others have nice stories, but there are no numbers, hard numbers to back it up. And that is a big problem. So one way of solving that is say, well, if we take that system of profit and loss accounting, which has been extremely powerful, but then corrected in the right way. So not to make it only reflect shareholder value in financial terms, but reflected the value you create as an organization to society. So that is what we call the integrated profit and loss, because you integrate various stakeholders and capitals. So you start with a traditional P&L, profit and loss statement, and what does it show at the bottom? What is the financial value you created for one stakeholder group, your shareholders? So if you extend this logic in two ways, firstly, you have more stakeholders. So you're also going to measure what is the value you created for your employees. For example, salaries is value for your employees. Taxes that you pay is value for society. Because without taxes, you have no roads, you have no education, you have no healthcare, you have no police. So taxes are extremely valuable to society. And then the other step is we don't only have financial capital. We also have natural capital, which we need to sustain ourselves. We have social capital, trust in society. We have human capital, health, and the productive capabilities of people. And we need all these capitals, intellectual capital, because we need technology. We need all these capitals for a thriving society. And interestingly is that such a P&L captures two things, and that is important to mention. On the one hand, it captures what is the well-being that was created over an accounting year. And so if you, for example, if you make chocolate, in that year many people consume chocolate and they had that increase to their well-being. Or if you make medicines, people use the medicines and that increased their health and their well-being. Yeah? The other way in which you can create value is that you increase the capitals of society. So if your intellectual capital is increased, if you have more factories, if your land has become more productive. So those two things, and also you can have a destruction of capital, of course, that at the end of the year there's less capital left than when you started. So these two things combined, the consumed well-being, created well-being during the accounting year, and the increase or decrease in the various capitals, that is what you could say that's the value to society that was created. So, a couple of examples. This is ExxonMobil, one of the first ones to publish an integrated profit and loss account. And they did it in their factory in Brazil. And a couple of interesting insights. So they did the entire value chain. So upstream suppliers, their own operations, and their downstream suppliers. And two things were relevant. First, they focused mainly on their clients and their suppliers, and most of their environmental initiatives were focused on suppliers. And then they asked, is that a logical thing? And in effect, the biggest negative impact on natural capital was in their clients. So that was an order of a magnitude larger. So most of their efforts should actually go into improving the impact at their clients. Another one was that they looked at, should we focus more on environmental or on social impacts? And there the answer was they didn't know, and if you quantified, is that their impact on natural capital was really much larger than on social capital. Quite logical for this sector. It's very intensive on natural resources, and labor productivity is very high, so you have less labor. In other sectors, that is flipped. Other example, Alliander, that's a Dutch energy networking company who did the same across all their 6 capitals. And interesting there was that they produced lots of value in terms of energy. And so the value of energy is much larger than the price that is paid. And so there's a lot of value, and that's quite logical. If you wouldn't have energy, electricity, or gas in your house, you would have a big problem. Yeah? So lots of value created by energy. On the other side, their carbon impact, first they thought, well, we're almost carbon neutral because our own operations is laying the transportation network. And if we follow, the rules in our sector, then we don't have any carbon emissions because the energy that we transport is not part of our value chain. But then thinking about it, you actually come to the conclusion that they also contribute to the energy system. So that if they transport energy that used coal and gas, then also they are partly responsible for that negative impact. So all of a sudden, from an almost carbon neutral company, they went to a company that had quite a large footprint, and that they actually also had to steer on the impact downstream and upstream. Yeah? So those are the types of insights that you can get. Now, as you can imagine, this is quite complex and there are quite a lot of assumptions. It is new, you have to be multidisciplinary, look at social sciences, natural sciences, etc. So we were, and also our partners are very happy when for the first time you have such an integrated profit and loss. And you have those capitals, the stakeholders, the various impacts, you quantify them first, then you can monetize them, and then you feel very happy. But then it only starts, because you want to use this to steer decisions. Because if you don't steer decisions, you're not having an impact. And then you have a problem. Because you can imagine if you have all those capitals and stakeholders, you can have hundreds of indicators. And you cannot steer on hundreds of indicators, right? On the other hand, you could also add them all up. But that would also cause a problem. And I think Kate also rightly points to that. Suppose we would add all the impacts up to one number. What kind of issues could arise? And we say we only steer on that. Any idea what could go wrong? Yep. Yeah, you lose the picture on the individual indicators. For example, you could go bankrupt. Huh? Lots of value for your clients, but then all the losses for your shareholders, and then you go bankrupt. So that's one problem. Another problem is that it could be that you have lots of profits, but you're destroying lots of forests. You have lots of child labor, forced labor, but still your profits are higher than your negative impact. And that's probably also something you don't want. Yeah.
How do you measure which is the best? Like, do I want to do more social impact or environmental impact? What is more important?
Yeah. So this gentleman asked the question, how do you measure what the most important one is? Well, what this says are two things. So you can quantify the facts based on what is the contribution to the well-being of people. Yeah, so for example, if you emit greenhouse gases, that leads in the future to increased food prices, it leads to more diseases, it leads to actual deaths related to the weather. So there are quite a lot of impacts on the well-being of people. Or if you produce medicine, you have an effect on the well-being of people through your medicines. And if you employ people, that creates a certain financial well-being because they have a salary, but also that can create some life satisfaction, but it also can create stress. And so for all of the impacts, you look at what is the effect on well-being. But then, as the gentleman before rightly noted, those are different stakeholders. So you don't want to create lots of value now at the expense, for example, of future generations. So that now you have lots of nice chocolate, for example, but then future generations don't have a good climate. So for this, we came up with a framework of impact statements. And the idea was just like in a financial statement, you think, what are the different goals I want to steer on? And similarly here, you think, what are the different goals? So we try to condense them with our partners to 4 goals. And we think you cannot take one out. So you need each of the goals. First goal is create value for investor, short-term and long-term. If you don't have this, then at least as a company you will go bankrupt and you can create no value in the future. Second, create value for all your stakeholders because you need them. If you don't create value for your clients, they will run away. If you don't create value for your employees, then they will go elsewhere. If you don't create value for society, then the regulators may think, hey, that's not good. And also you may think, why am I on Earth? Why am I working 40 hours, 30 hours, 60 hours if we're not creating value for society? What's the purpose? Third, doing no harm. So this is a very important one. So here you look at the negative externalities. So social externalities like child labor, underpayment, under-earning, gender rights discriminations, etc. And you look at environmental costs. So carbon, climate, land use, biodiversity, pollution of air, water and soil. And all those in absolute terms, because that becomes important, this may be smaller. You want this to be as close to zero as possible. You don't want to have lots of well-being this year and then eat the resources for future generations, for example. Or create a nice experience for your clients at the expense of slaves in your upstream supply chain. And this also ties in quite nicely to the various boundaries. Because to come to this, you have to set some thresholds, and we're quite strict. So each ton of carbon that you emit, that's above the threshold. Yeah? So each unit of child labor that you're responsible of, that is above the thresholds. So if this is zero, the do no harm, if you have zero external costs, then you're fully sustainable. Yeah? So we think that's a very precise way to make sustainability actionable. Yeah? So if you want to stay within the donut, that would be my kind of challenging suggestion, then you have to make sure you have no external costs. Yeah? The fourth one is you also want to have a positive impact. I say I go beyond my strict negative responsibility. I also want to create a positive impact, and I want to contribute to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So, and then as in the in your financial statement, for each of your goals you have a statement. So you have to steer on your profit, so you have a profit and loss statement. But you also have to steer on your cash flows. And therefore, you have a cash flow statement, and you have to steer on your balance position, and that's why you have a balance sheet statement. Similarly, for each of these goals, you can have a statement so that you know what you're steering on. So these are some steps how you can do that. And then it goes to the three. Yeah, so once you decided why do I want to do that, it goes to measure, report, and steer. So you have to measure it so that you know what it is. Report it internally, externally, so that people can inform their decisions. And then the final step is steering, okay? Because you want to use it to have better impact. So what's important also to mention, of course, that it's a journey. Yeah? It's not easy to implement this, both in terms of measuring it, but also in terms of actually doing it. So it's a journey, and it doesn't always go in one straight line. And you can start small. Start with one business unit. You can start with exploring it, and then move the way up to saying, well, I want my whole organization to be steering on impact. But it takes a couple of years. So, with this said, I would like to give the floor to Tjeerd.
We'll see if is my mic working? Or do we have the same challenge here? No, mine is working. Okay, thanks Adrian for this introduction. I always like to leave the more technical stuff to Adrian. And move to the practical stuff of how we implemented this at ABN AMRO in the last couple of years. So the journey of reporting at ABN AMRO and moving into impact reporting as a final step, or as for now a final step in that journey. So this is our CEO, at least until April next year, because he just announced over the weekend that he was not going to go for another term. But he takes long-term value creation seriously, and we want to report, measure, steer, or measure, report, steer. So first we measure it. That was our first step in this impact journey, to allow, in the end, him and his colleagues at board level to steer on it. I think most of you in the room will know this guy, and maybe will know his quote as well, but I like to use it because once these guys and these institutions are expressing an interest in positive contribution to society, long-term value creation, showing the impact, and if these kinds of investors are asking companies, what is your actual impact? Just by asking the question, he sets a lot in motion. So that's my comment on that, and my push to the investor community as well. They should ask many more questions. They should be handled by investor relations and by CFO, not by sustainability people, but by investor relations and CFOs, because that is their entry point in major companies. So this is ABN AMRO. Our purpose is to bank for better for generations to come. Our strategy is called To Accelerate the Sustainability Shift, and we aim to support our clients' transition to sustainability. So that's all very, you could say, very nice and very well. But what is our impact? And are we accelerating the sustainability shift? Are we on the right track? Can we measure? Can we report? Can we actually steer on this? And that's where, this is a reporting conference, right? Sometimes I forget it. I forget where I am actually, but this is a reporting conference. So from a reporting perspective, this is what we call material topics or materiality. And these are the material topics linked to the strategy of ABN AMRO. And I'm not going to go through them individually, but these topics enable us to create value. At least that's what we hope. And we also hope that this value will be a positive value or a positive impact. But we also have fundamentals of doing business. So we can only create value if the fundamentals of doing business are okay. So if we are there for the longer term, and if we have a viable business model, and if we comply with regulations, if we have good corporate governance, all these are the basics of being in banking. So they're not material or differentiating or value creators in itself. They're kind of like fundamentals, and this is, you could say for any bank, this is to have your house in order. And again, the question is, okay, are we doing well? Are we creating positive impact? Are we creating value for the stakeholders or rights holders or whatever stakeholder group that we feel is important? And can we measure, report, and steer on impact? So that's where the journey began on impact reporting. Measure, report, and steer. I think we're only at level B, to be honest, at the moment. I think we're at the level of having decent measurements, having a first impact report. I encourage you to have a look at it, but I don't think we're at the level of actually steering on less negative or more positive impact. Only at the beginning. And we started this journey back in 2012 when we did a first kind of a pilot study. We did one for mortgages, which is a big business for our bank, 150 billion in Dutch mortgages. So it's good to have the sense of an impact there. We did one on cacao. We did some work on the diamond trade. Last year we did some work on human capital development. And so this year, or the 2018 impact report was on the full impact on all 6 capitals for all 4 stakeholder groups. And this was, so we were on the journey of integrated reporting since 2014, 2015. So we were used to the 6 capitals on the left, and we're used to the 4 rights holders or stakeholders on the right. And to combine these and to try and assess the impacts on all 4 stakeholder groups based on all 6 capitals, and then to monetize those capitals or those impacts, that was the challenge that we had for 2018. We used the framework that Adrian just described, so I won't go into that, but this is a very helpful framework. It gives some guidance and it gives some direction. And this is one of the items that came up. We create, and this is, so at ABN AMRO we like these kinds of sheets. They're very easy, simple. We create positive value, positive impact for these 4 stakeholder groups. And everyone likes this one. There's no, well, there is some debate on how did you get to these numbers and is it all true? But it's a very, it paints quite a positive picture. Maybe a too positive picture. Also related to the question Adrian just asked to the audience. Are there then no negative impacts? Yes, there are. They're on this sheet. So if you try to monetize on all capitals and all stakeholder groups, you will have negative impact. Traditionally, in a P&L, a negative impact would come up red. But at ABN AMRO, we don't like red as a color. So we had a big debate. It took a couple of days, and we decided to make it gray. And then we needed to add an index to explain what the word gray meant. And gray means negative impact or negative input. So this is based on the profit and loss. And you can see we have a negative impact on natural capital as a bank. It's mainly negative for society, right? That's a negative impact that we have. And we specifically chose to use these circles and these circles represent a number or a range of a monetized number. But we wanted to avoid that it all came back to this. If you add it all up, it's a positive impact, we're making money, everything is on the right track. So we want to avoid netting it out, netting the impacts out, and also to just to give you a sense of direction on where the value or the impact is created. Then we try to split it out for different stakeholder groups. So this is part of our value creation model. And to be more specific on, for instance, clients, what do they put in? They bring us money, right? They bring us deposits. They pay interests. They pay fees. So that's financial capital flowing into ABN AMRO. And what do we do with it? We turn them into manufactured capital, so products, mortgages, loans, some financial returns on investments, etc. We did the same for employees. For society, this may be an interesting one, because here you see on the bottom right the negative flow. So the dotted line means a negative flow of natural capital. So ABN AMRO has, or banks, but ABN AMRO at least as well, has negative impact on natural capital. This is now something that we can measure and report. And for investors, we always thought the main return is financial, but it's also into some human and social and manufactured capital as well. We create products for them, for investors at large. So you can't read this, but this is the value creation model all combined, and the flows kind of show you where the biggest values and impacts are. And it's bringing them all together. You can read it if you want in our integrated report. The do no harm part, that was very, very important for us to be able to show these negative impacts as well. And to see that where is the negative? Because you can only have, well, you can have an impact in two ways. You can have an impact in reducing negative impact or in increasing your positive impact. And I believe we need to do both, right? So we need to have focus on the negatives, and at the same, and try and reduce that, and at the same time try and improve the positive. We had all this data, or the Impact Institute had gathered all this data, and based on this data, we could also translate our impacts based on the SDGs. And these are the three that we feel have the biggest, we as a financial institution or at ABN AMRO have the biggest impact on, so it's 8, 12, and 13. And this is the picture that I use internally a lot because it raises a lot of questions. So how come we feel that we have most impact on 8, 12, and 13, when in fact it's rather negative? And it's not really big numbers. It's not really huge numbers that the monetized impacts are on a P&L basis. Until you realize that this is on an annual income statement. So this is not the balance sheet of the bank, this is the annual profit and loss. So our annual loss on climate is between 100 and 500 million. On the total profits of ABN AMRO, total financial profits that people recognize or enjoy talking about, the total profits of ABN AMRO financial profits is about 2 billion on an annual basis. So this could be 25 to 50% of our annual financial profit. That is a big number in banking. So we've produced all these balance sheet or profit and loss statements and tried to be as transparent as possible. It turned out to be quite an extensive report of about, I don't know, what is it, 60, 70 pages, because we wanted the market and other companies to also follow the example, because this is if we're the only company doing this, then it's very hard for others, but also for ourselves to be able to steer on this, to have some sort of comparison, some sort of guidance. If you're the only company or financial company to have this, then it will be challenging for the next couple of years. So what are our next steps? We mentioned this, I think, a couple of times, but the obvious next step is to steer. We will keep measuring, we will keep reporting, but the obvious next step is to steer and to integrate all these facts into our decision making. That's it for now. Thank you for listening, and I think now we have some time for questions, maybe, Ralph? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Please have a seat as well. Indeed, we have time for a couple of questions, and I have one, and we will then collect a couple of questions for 1 or 2 rounds, and then finish up on time. In our work, we've been using the octopus model of the IARC from input through business model to output to outcome to impact. And then you see various other companies in the meanwhile also trying to go one step further, which they say, how is that adding value to society? So that is one step further than I think that classical impact reporting. Well, I shouldn't call it classical because it's not even really existing. You're the first, I think, as far as I remember, to come up with that. So both in your methodological approach, but also in your practical approach, what are your plans around moving to that one extra layer, which we would call system value? Yeah.
Can you explain it again?
Well, system value is the next step from just looking at impact, but having that context-based, and it is already multi-capital based, but then also based on the context of thresholds and allocations. So if you put your performance, your impact against those thresholds and allocations, that is sort of, for us at least, the ultimate way to describe a value to society.
Yeah, I think content-wise that's implicit. Yeah, so the IPNLs are made in such a way that if you would add all the IPNLs of all the companies, in a country, for example, it would add to the total impact of that country. Or if you add all the companies in a value chain, for example, the CO2 impact would be the total CO2. And so that allocation is already implicitly there. And also the thresholds are there. So there's a 0 point, but that is quite strict. So for carbon, you say, well, 1 ton of carbon is already a ton of carbon too much because the system is not in equilibrium. 1 liter of pollution is already too much. The only thresholds that's not 0 is in underpayment, because then in each country you need to have a certain minimum wage. And so implicit, those things are there because you need them to actually, if you don't have them, you cannot really calculate it well, or you would come with P&Ls that are not additive or comparable.
Yeah, in addition to that, so from a bank perspective, this is all about our scope 3, right? So this is all, our impact is all through our client. Our biggest impact is through our clients.
Yeah.
And that's all in this impact statement. So a lot of other industries mainly focus on scope 1 and 2 and develop thresholds and allocations based on that. We're trying to develop thresholds and allocations based on our scope 3, so how much is in our value chains. So we're working on what's called science-based targets, together with other banks, developing thresholds, allocations. It's one of the most important questions. How much are we allowed to finance? How much are our clients allowed to, let's say, pollute, just for the more developed natural capital part? And that's a challenging question in our scope 3. I think all banks are working on it. It's a project called Science-Based Targets with the World Resource Institute. And it's a good next step. Okay,
thank you. Let's collect a couple of questions. I see Jesse here. I see Dirk over there. Max, I think was your name? Oh, Joris, sorry. Okay, let's start with Jesse.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes, I think so. Wonderful work. I really like it. I'm a systems ecologist, though, and I look at things like how it takes the whole world to deliver any individual product. And so if you look at that from a systems view, you turn it around, it takes every dollar then pays for all the impacts of the world in proportion to its share of the economy. And that's the general rule of economic impact assessment, is dividing up the whole pie in slices equal to your proportion of the economy. But that also means that you're going to pay for a lot of negative things, and the difference, the line is not 0. You can't achieve 0. The line you can achieve is what's sustainable. And of course, then you look at the handling of money and your responsibility. If you're going to recouple your awareness of the responsibility of money, the biggest impact of money is the use of profits to multiply businesses and profits. So that's a systemic indicator that would fit into Ralph's question. Are we taking our world in a systemically sustainable direction? And presently, because we are aiming to compound investments forever, the answer is no, in a systemic view. So I would love to see your response to this.
Okay, let's move to Dirk. Let's collect those three.
Thanks. My compliments, and it's really nice first to develop the methodology, but also to apply it in a real-world setting. And you're right, the exciting thing is the next stage, steering, and maybe to open the discussion a little bit. You asked multiple indicators. One indicator is very easy. So now you have this net value for the different stakeholders. You even have the principle of no harm. If there are any trade-offs between them, how are you planning to do it? $1 for one, or is one more important than the other? How can we steer if we have more than one indicator?
Yeah. Okay, and yours as a third.
Hi, I'm Joris. I have a question about the following. As a bank, of course, you need to make money, you need to make a profit. If I'm a company and I'd like to have a loan, I have to pay, for example, 3% interest on that, which means that the next year I will need to have to make a profit of at least 3% on that loan in order to pay that back, which implies a growth. And you can also see that since we got the fiat system where there's more and more debt coming into the system, which got really big. How is ABN AMRO going to make its profit in the future if we're not going towards a growth that I just described before, but more towards a thriving, blossoming economy?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's an easy question, right? Well, they're all easy questions. So first, Dirk, on your point, how can you steer on more indicators? Companies have been doing that for hundreds of years, right? We have like 20 financial KPIs. Return on equity, core equity, tier 1, RARO, RAC. We call them all kinds of different names. And we're used to that. What we're adding to the mix is other indicators that show other impacts than just financials. And I'm a strong believer that these other impacts have a predictive value of your future financials. So if you have, let's say, high core equity tier 1, or return, let's use return on equity, it's more common. So we have a huge return on equity, but we have very much negative impact on human capital in our value chain somewhere. It will come out. So, and it will come out as negative financial impact as well. So it's so to steer on do no harm, or at least have a visible metric, measuring a visible metric. How are we performing? How are we impacting human capital somewhere in our value chains? That's even for the hardcore financial people in banks, which we have a lot of, is a relevant metric to have on their dashboard. So we can steer on hundreds of indicators, but the objective is to have the right ones there, and to integrate them into decision making. And that was also part of your question. How can we swap a euro negative impact on human for a euro positive impact on social or on financial? And at the moment, I think this is part of decision making. It's fact of life. We're doing this, but we're not doing it consciously. We're doing it implicit, and sometimes not even knowing about it. So what this does, this whole concept of integrated thinking and applying all the capitals and all these metrics into your decision making, it brings it to the surface, and hopefully, that's at least my conviction, it will lead to better decision making, and then I can address your point. If we're able to make better decisions, we will have a viable business model for future. So we'll have a future-proof business model. I don't really agree on the 3%. so nobody's forced to have loans or whatever, and it's not the money-making instrument of banks that are driving this. It's the mono lens of financial capital. So just looking at financial capital for value creation, that leads to these kinds of wrongdoings. I'm looking for a better word, but that's what it leads to. If you're just looking through a financial lens, you'll end up with this. And I'm hoping that looking through the lenses of all capitals, transparent and seeing the impacts there, that it will lead to better decision making. Okay. I'll leave the first question to Adrian.
Yeah, the question about is zero the zero line?
Yeah.
So if I understood well, I think we need more, two things. We need more data, because you will want to see the value drivers. So if I invest $1 in different sector or different companies, what is actually the return, the true return to society? But to have that information, we need more data. But I think it's a very important question. But I think more data is needed. And I think one point to the growth, you can have interest rates in a stable economy within the limits of the boundaries. And in fact, you can also have sustainable growth, but it should be, A, you should be within the boundaries, and B, the growth shouldn't be higher than the technological growth rate, right? So if technological production factor increases, then you can actually have growth. So, I agree with you.
Thank you. And unfortunately, I need to stop here because we have a follow-up session right away, and this is one of the 2 moments during the conference where you all have to choose. There's on the one hand a session here, and there are 2 of the campfires at the Polak building, which you would now need to decide which one you want to follow. So we do a 2-minute break so that we have that transition possibility, and also mic up our next speakers and then move into that next session. Thank you.